The final way of knowing that influences our schema is faith. Faith is defined as complete trust or confidence in something or someone. The important thing to note about faith is that it doesn't have to be based in facts, it doesn't have to be based on logic, and it doesn't even have to be based on one's sensory perception. Oftentimes, faith is used despite evidence that would seem to disprove it. The most common application of faith is in religion. Religious people often have trust in a God based only on a collection of texts, such as the Quran or the Bible, for example. Like reason, faith is another way in which our schema is applied to our everyday lives. It doesn't actually make up our schema like sensory perception does. So in this way, reason and faith are different ways in which our sensory perception is used. Which is not to say that faith and reason are mutually exclusive. For example, a scientist may take a known scientific principle, which was gathered through reason, and use it as a springboard to have faith that other unknown principles will work in a similar way. This is a sort of a chicken and the egg type relationship, in that reason can lead to faith, which can lead to reason, which can lead to faith. Now let's talk more specifically about how faith affects our schema. One seemingly dangerous effect of applying our schema to the world through faith is what's known as a confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is defined as the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing belief or theory. Someone who falls victim to a confirmation bias would find excuses or justification that supports their belief, even if there's evidence that suggests otherwise. In terms of our schema, past experiences that support a preconceived belief may be overvalued, while a past experience that contradicts this belief may be altered or even dismissed altogether. Alright, so now let's discuss some real-life examples of how our sensory perception, reason, and faith work together to influence our schema. When I was a child, I grew up in a very religious family. My schema was built up of my sensory perception of the time, which was reading religious texts, viewing religious art, and listening to religious sermons. Through these senses, I used both reason and faith to develop my understanding of the world. So if someone were to ask the 6-year-old version of myself how the universe began, I would reply that God created it in 6 days and rested on the 7th. In this example, it's clear how reason and faith depend entirely on our past experiences, made up of our sensory perception. It was not unreasonable for me to conclude that God created the worlds in this way, because that was the conclusion that my senses led me to. Further, my faith that God was real grew from the makeup of my sensory perception at the time. This is an example of how faith and reason are both less important to our schema than our sensory perception. So are there circumstances in which the methods through which we utilize our sensory perception, either faith or reason, are more important than our actual sensory perception? Take, for example, this dilemma and our ability to make decisions. My cousin, who's always been a stoner, promised my aunt that he had given up drugs a few months ago. All was well for a few weeks, but one day my aunt decided to snoop in his backpack while he wasn't looking and found some weed. When confronted about it, my cousin said that it wasn't his, and he had no idea how it got into his backpack. He tried to convince his mom that his friend probably put it in there by mistake. So does she believe him? Well, that decision depends entirely on how she applied her schema to the situation. If she uses faith, she would believe her son and let him off with a warning. This would be a type of confirmation bias, in that she desperately wants to believe that her son is not doing drugs anymore, and therefore would dismiss the evidence in favor of her faith. If she uses reason, however, she may conclude that the weed is proof that her son is back on drugs, and hence would not believe his story. In this example, 2 different decisions are made that depend entirely on what way of knowing is utilized. She has access to the same sensory perception in both cases. The memory that her son has a history of drugs and the ability to see the drugs in his backpack. Still, 2 different decisions are able to be made. Finally, let's delve into our real-life example, Kellyanne Conway, and her acceptance of alternative facts. First, we have to start with her sensory perception. Because she has considered herself a conservative for many years, we can conclude that something in her past led her into this belief. While we don't know specifics, sensory perception such as listening to her parents or being exposed to conservative role models, which she probably listened to, played a role in her development into a conservative. Knowing this, we can decipher how reasoned faith played a role in her acceptance of Donald Trump's inauguration crowd size. It seems that faith probably played the most prominent role in her acceptance of the facts. Specifically, her faith in an authority figure, Donald Trump, pushed her into a confirmation bias. As a campaign manager for Trump, she would greatly benefit from Trump being accurate with his facts. Further, it's literally her job to defend Trump from those who disagree. So it was these incentives that prompted her faith in Trump's numbers and led her to dismiss the inauguration numbers reported by the National Park Service.
As discovered in this investigation, reason, sensory perception, and faith have a huge impact in the things that we accept, just from being human beings and from taking in all the experiences that we're going to have and the opinions that we form about certain people throughout the examples that we've described, including the Kellyanne Conway example. It's pretty clear to see that the way you're raised, as well as the lifestyle that you're around most constantly, are what are going to affect your acceptance of facts. We probably wouldn't even have the term alternative fact if it wasn't for the staunch differences between the backgrounds of conservatives and the backgrounds of liberals in the United States. Now, we discovered a lot about what makes up schema and the most important parts of schema when it comes to making a logical decision. Unfortunately, we live in a society where faith is one of the most dominating factors when it comes to which things you're going to perceive as correct or incorrect. America has a large population of people that are more skeptical of scientists than they are of perhaps religious leaders or politicians, which definitely seems to imply that to most people in the United States, the factor of faith that makes up schema is far more important than reason. At the same time, sensory perception plays a huge role in what we accept, as there are a lot of people with disorders such as color blindness and other sort of hallucinatory effects of illnesses, mental illness, and disabilities of our senses might alter the way that we even perceive reality in the first place, let alone how we use reason to decode those things that we take in from our eyes and every other sense. The most important thing to take away from this investigation is the knowledge we gain in terms of how schema accepts which facts are going to be the ones that our brain uses when we form our own opinions. And there is no universal standard in terms of which facts are correct, and there is no universal being or league of high standing people that are going to tell us which facts are true just by the definition and just by the fact that humans have the ability to form their own opinions means there's always going to be disagreements with facts. And from this point forward, and since the beginning of time, there's always going to be people who insist that they have alternative facts that can disprove what might be true. And sometimes, in some cases, the alternative fact might be the one that's true. But unfortunately, there is no way to totally prove either one. And the only thing we can do is disprove certain alternative facts or just plain facts in general. As for the case of Kellyanne Conway, first schema happened to be one of conservative Republican background, obviously being the primary campaign manager for Donald Trump. She has an extensive reason and incentive to push the things that Republicans are going to want, and especially her boss, Donald Trump. In terms of inauguration sizes, Kellyanne Conway put a lot of faith into her acceptance of the facts that came in from Sean Spicer's data as opposed to the National Park Service. This is just one example of how faith makes up schema, which makes up our decisions just from being human beings and naturally having bias. Someone from the left side of the political spectrum who perhaps is more inclined to support Hillary Clinton, for example, might take on information that is gained from a press conference with Barack Obama more than they're willing to accept a fact that comes from a Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Now, the conclusion to this investigation is that sensory perception, reason, and faith all play an even role in making up our schema. And schema is perhaps the biggest factor in the acceptance of data, which makes up facts, which makes our arguments. And as long as everyone is raised with different backgrounds and in different societies, there will always be disagreements in schema, and therefore there will always be disagreements in facts.